This happened years ago, when my girlfriend lived in an old, tiny one-room apartment. It was the kind of place you rent when you're broke and don't care about comfort. Thin walls, freezing in winter, sweltering in summer. The building was ancient, with a combined bathroom and shower, and you could hear everything. Footsteps on the external staircase, muffled conversations next door, the works. She didn't mind though. My girlfriend had nerves of steel, the type of person who could shrug off anything. Her no-nonsense personality was a big part of why I liked her so much. Most of the time we stayed at my place since it was closer to both our university and my part-time job. But one weekend, about 2 months into our relationship, she invited me to stay over at hers. When I arrived, she immediately started tidying up, muttering, "This place is a mess." Even though it wasn't. It was small but clean, with just enough room for a bed, a tiny table, and a kitchenette that barely fit 2 people. You could hear the neighbor's TV through the walls, so she kept her own on as background noise to drown it out. That night we had a few drinks and curled up in her narrow bed. It was cozy, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Maybe it was just the unfamiliar setting. I brushed it off and I fell asleep. Later I woke up in the middle of the night. The room was silent, except for the hum of the fridge. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her, and grabbed a water bottle from the table. That's when I heard it. A whisper, low and raspy, coming from somewhere in the room. At first I thought it was her talking in her sleep, but when I looked, she was sound asleep with her back turned to me. I froze, I held my breath, and I focused on the sound. "Get out! Get out!" The words were barely audible, but unmistakable. A chill ran down my spine. I shook her awake, and I said, "Hey, do you want to go to the convenience store or something? I feel like going out." I said that while trying to keep my voice steady. She groaned and rolled over and said, It's 3 a.m. Can it wait?" "Please," I insisted. I didn't want to freak her out, but I couldn't stay in that room for a second longer. She finally agreed, rolling her eyes as we got dressed, and as we walked out, I whispered, "I think your neighbor's weird. They're whispering something. Get out, get out." "Oh, that voice," she said casually. "You heard it too?" "What do you mean, too?" "It's not the neighbor. It's just something in the room." I stopped dead in my tracks. "What do you mean, something?" She sighed, like she'd explained this 100 times before. The voice shows up sometimes, whispers stuff, moves things around. It's harmless, you just ignore it. Turn the TV up so you don't hear it. I stared at her dumbfounded. How could she be so calm about this? When we went back to her room, it was eerily quiet. She climbed back into bed like nothing happened. "See," she said, "if you don't pay attention to it, it usually leaves you alone." But I couldn't ignore the water bottle on the table. Now, lying on its side, I was certain that I set it upright. I mean, everybody does that, right? You take a drink of water, you put it down, you don't put it on its side. We had just left and now we came back to it on its side. It made no sense. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone or something was standing just out of sight, watching. The whispers started again too, faint but persistent, and I couldn't wait for the sun to rise. I swore to myself I'd never stay in that room again, but that wasn't the end of it. Over time, my girlfriend opened up about her experiences, and I'd like to share another one with you. She'd always been sensitive to things like this, ever since she was a kid. Most people didn't believe her, so she learned to brush it off and deal with it quietly. One night she told me a story about her grandfather's funeral. Her family had held a wake at their home, and it was a big affair with relatives staying over. That night they took turns keeping vigil by the altar, ensuring the incense and candles didn't burn out. She joined in, but eventually sleep got the better of her, and she went upstairs to her room. As she was drifting off, she heard a faint tapping at her window. Tap, tap, tap. At first, she thought it was just a tree branch or something, but the tapping came again, deliberate and steady. Her cousin, who was sleeping in the same room, woke up and asked, "What's that noise?" "Probably the window," she replied. "Do you think it's Grandpa?" her cousin whispered. "No," she said bluntly. "It's not him." Her cousin turned pale and crawled into her bed, trembling. My girlfriend just laughed it off and went to sleep. But the next morning the adults were talking about something strange. The doorbell had rung in the middle of the night. No one answered it, believing it was bad luck to welcome visitors during a wake. But when they checked the intercom feed, they had one of those camera doorbells. There was nothing, just the empty porch. That's when I realized it might have been a Kasha, she told me. "A what?" "Kasha. It's a yokai that drags evil souls to hell. Now, Grandpa didn't do anything bad, but sometimes they're drawn to places where death lingers. It must have been something like that." I felt a chill run down my spine. "So, it was looking for someone?" I asked her. "Maybe. Or it was just hungry. They're always described as starving, desperate to feed on souls." I couldn't shake the image of a gaunt, shadowy figure lurking outside, waiting for an invitation. After that, I stopped questioning her calmness about the paranormal. She'd grown up with it, accepted it and moved on, but me, I'm still haunted by that whisper that I heard in her apartment. It was just the beginning of what I'd start to notice. Shadows in the corner of my eye, faint knocks at my door, and the feeling of never being alone. It was almost as if, when I met her, something got invited in. This one comes from someone who worked in construction. It's about an incident that happened during a sewer evacuation in Noboribetsu, a small town in Hokkaido. You might know Noboribetsu as a famous hot spring town, a place where people go to unwind and relax, but under that serene surface, something much darker was buried, allegedly. The crew was working on laying some new sewer lines, which meant digging deep into the earth. As you can imagine, when you're dealing with sewage systems, bad smells are part of the job. But this time the stench wasn't just your usual rotten egg smell or decaying organic matter. It was different, pungent, sour, and strangely metallic. One of the workers described it as the kind of smell that sticks to the back of your throat, like something you'd expect to find in an abandoned slaughterhouse. At first they thought it might just be some decomposing animal remains, but as they dug deeper, the excavator's bucket scraped against something hard, brittle. They stopped the machinery, curious. One of the workers hopped down into the pit to see what it was. He pulled up what looked like an old, weathered bone. Then they realized it was human. A skull, dirt-encrusted and yellowed with age, stared back at them. The discovery should have been shocking, but the site supervisor barely batted an eyelid. "Looks like we've hit the jackpot," he muttered, almost jokingly, before instructing the crew to keep going. As they did, more bones began to emerge, not just one skeleton, dozens, then what seemed like hundreds. The workers started whispering amongst themselves, exchanging nervous glances. This wasn't some old forgotten graveyard. It felt like it was something far worse. Mass burial sites have been discovered in history, after all. Wars, plagues, crimes people would rather leave unspoken, but this felt deliberate, calculated. When the site supervisor realized how extensive the discovery was, he finally made a call, not to the police, but to their company's higher-ups. A couple of hours later, a sleek black car pulled up to the site, and out stepped a local city councilman. One of those types with perfectly pressed suits and an aura of smug authority. He looked down at the pit for a moment, then turned to the workers and said something that chilled them to the bone. "What you've seen here today, you'll forget. Consider this a non-event." The crew protested. Surely this needed to be reported, investigated. But the councilman just waved them off, muttering something about protecting the town's reputation. After all, Noboribetsu thrived on its image as a tranquil hot spring getaway. A mass grave of unknown origin wasn't exactly good for tourism. And then just like that, the entire project was shut down. Not postponed, but erased, as if it had never happened. The site was quietly filled in, and the equipment removed overnight. Rumor has it that the skeletons were left in the ground, their story buried alongside them. But here's the thing. Some of the workers started talking. You don't stumble across something like that and keep it bottled up forever. The story leaked, spreading through whispers and online forums. Some people speculated about wartime atrocities, or maybe some kind of ancient ritual site. Others suggested organized crime, an old yakuza dumping ground perhaps. As for the councilman, he disappeared from the public eye not long after. Maybe he retired, or maybe he just knew too much. Even now, people in Noboribetsu speak in hushed tones about what might still lie beneath the town's picturesque streets. If you visit, you might want to stick to the hot springs and stay away from any construction sites. Who knows what else could be buried down there? Okay, so this happened about 10 years ago, and I swear it's all true. Maybe it's not the scariest thing ever, but it's stuck with me since. Back then, my girlfriend and I decided to drive from Fukuoka to Kumamoto for a little trip. The plan was to leave late at night and crash at a love hotel along the way. We hit the road at about 11 p.m., cruising down the highway. By about 1 a.m., the vibe had shifted. Neither of us were talking, we were just too tired at that point, and I was getting drowsy. We started looking for a love hotel. We passed a few. There are always loads dotted alongside the national highways, but my girlfriend kept complaining. Too old, too expensive, too sketchy. By 2 a.m. I had had enough. I told her that the next hotel we saw was it. No arguments. Finally, we spotted a sign for a place just off the highway. It was this big, plain white building, totally unremarkable. She immediately said, "This place gives me a bad feeling, let's keep driving." But at this point, I wasn't hearing it. We pulled in, and it didn't look like any love hotel I'd seen before. No flashy signs, no vibe at all. Just the standard boring automatic doors that led to a cold, empty lobby. The guy at the counter handed us a key without even choosing a room. Super weird for a love hotel. If anybody's been, you'll know that they usually give you a selection. There's a panel where you get to pick your room. Whatever though, we were exhausted. The room was on the second floor. No elevator, just this dingy stairwell with sticky vinyl floors that made your shoes squeak, which felt kind of sterile and odd. The room itself? Bland as hell. It looked more like a budget hotel than anything romantic. There was a random poster of Nagabuchi Tsuyoshi, a singer, taped on the wall above the bed. The whole vibe was off. Even worse, there was this heavy, uncomfortable feeling in the air, like the room didn't even want us there. Or perhaps that it simply wasn't meant for us. It's really hard to describe looking back. We usually would take a shower or a bath, and I had hoped that we may end up using the Love Hotel for its intended purpose, but it didn't seem on the cards that night, so I didn't bother taking a shower or a bath. We joked about how awful the place was for a bit, trying to make light of our situation. She wanted to freshen up, so while she did that, I lay on the bed and began to drift off. It wasn't long after that I felt it. The bed dipped like someone had sat down on it. My eyes shot open, but no one was there. Just this small dent in the blanket, like an invisible weight. And then I heard her scream. I ran into the bathroom. She was crouched down, pale and shaking. "Don't creep up on me like that again. You scared the hell out of me," she snapped. I froze. I thought, what the hell are you talking about? I've been on the bed the whole time. But I just said sorry because I literally wanted nothing more than to go to sleep. And if I said that it wasn't me, then there's no way that she'd be sleeping there that night. We wouldn't be getting back on the road to go on our trip. We'd be getting back on the road to go home, no doubt, and I didn't want to do that. She glared at me after I apologized, but then her face softened. I figured it out. She had seen something in the mirror behind her, a shadow or some kind of figure. She was too freaked out to explain it properly, and honestly, I didn't want to press her, so, like I said, I told her it was me. After that, we climbed into bed and tried to sleep. Now, usually she complained about how much I snored, and she would sleep as close as she possibly could to the edge of the opposite side of the bed, to not be disturbed by me. But that night she was different. For some reason she clung to me. She wanted nothing but closeness. She didn't say anything at the time, but I'm sure that was the point that she realized that something about that room was off too. The room just felt wrong, even with the lights on. The shadows seemed too dark and I couldn't relax. Every sound made me jump, exhausted though I was. At some point I woke up again, and this time I was frightened. Something was watching us. I could feel it. I glanced over at her. Her eyes were shut tight, again, not in a peaceful way. It was like she was forcing them closed, like she was pretending to sleep. Then I saw them. At the foot of the bed were two little boys. I could see their eyes staring right at me. I blinked, and they were gone. It's like they disappeared almost into the room itself, fast as lightning. I shook her awake, and she admitted that she had been awake the whole time. While she got dressed, I noticed the Nagabuchi poster on the wall. Something about it bugged me. The corner was peeling slightly, so I tugged on it. Underneath the wall was damp, almost sweaty, and there were faint scribbles, like a kid's drawing in crayon. We grabbed our stuff and bolted. At checkout, I told the front desk guy, "Hey, there's kids in that room." He didn't even flinch. He just said, "Do you want to switch rooms?" "No way," I snapped. My girlfriend was practically shaking. They ended up giving us a discount, but I didn't care. We just wanted out. As we drove away, we passed the Love Hotel sign again. I hadn't noticed it earlier, but under the name of the hotel, in faded letters, were Former Pediatric Hospital. Later, she told me more. She'd seen the boys too, and their mother, a woman who had stood in the corner glaring at us with a twisted expression. She also said that she felt the kids running around the room. I don't know what happened in that place, but I'll never forget it. We haven't talked about it much since, and honestly, I'd prefer to keep it that way. It was really scary. This happened when I was in elementary school, probably around 3rd or 4th grade. It was a warm summer day, and my family of 4, my parents, my younger sister, and I, had planned on going on a camping trip. We had our usual seating arrangement in the car. Dad drove, Mum sat in the front passenger seat, my sister sat on the right side of the back seat, and I was on the left. Both my sister and I were prone to car sickness, so we always rode with the windows down, faces turned towards the breeze. This time we were headed to a new campsite we'd never visited before. The scenery was idyllic, a patchwork of rice fields and quiet, rural roads. At some point though, Dad got lost. This was back in the days before GPS, so we ended up driving in circles, retracing the same roads over and over. There wasn't another soul in sight. Eventually Dad stopped the car to reassess our route, and by pure chance, he noticed a fallen signpost. He got out, set it upright, and realized it pointed the way to the campsite. We followed the direction the sign indicated, which led us onto a winding mountain road. My sister's side of the car faced the steep slope of the mountain, while my side overlooked a scattering of trees and a narrow river below. The sound of rushing water and the rustling leaves was oddly soothing as the car made its slow ascent. Then the scenery changed. We came upon a clearing, wide and open, unlike anything we'd seen so far. It was as if the dense forest had just been suddenly replaced by an expansive meadow. The shift was abrupt, jarring even. What caught my attention the most was an old rust-covered bus parked in the distance. At first I thought it was just abandoned, but then I noticed movement inside. There were people on that bus. I leaned closer to the window, squinting to get a better look. That's when my stomach turned cold. The people weren't ordinary passengers. They were men, women, even children, all in various states of disarray. Their clothes were tattered, stained with dirt and blood. Some had bandages haphazardly wrapped around their heads, while others bore open wounds. Their faces were pale, gaunt, and lifeless. Every single one of them was staring directly at me. Their empty, hollow eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. I felt my heart lurch, and instinctively I looked away, burying my face into my lap. My chest felt tight, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. When I finally mustered the courage to look up again, the bus was gone. So was the clearing. The meadow had been replaced by the ordinary mountain road, as if nothing had happened. The car bumped along, and my parents were chatting like usual, completely unaware of what I'd just seen. My sister, too, seemed oblivious, her gaze fixed on the scenery outside of the window. I didn't say anything. I didn't dare. The rest of the trip went by without incident. We reached the campsite, enjoyed our stay, and eventually we returned home. But I couldn't shake what I had seen. The rusting bus, the injured passengers, their vacant stares. Everything felt so real, yet it didn't make sense. As I grew older, I started to wonder if what I saw was real or if it was just some kind of hallucination. But the memory refuses to fade. It wasn't just a fleeting vision. It was too vivid, too detailed. The clearing, the bus, the people, they all felt out of place, like they didn't belong in the fabric of reality we were driving through. Looking back, it reminds me of stories people share about glitches in the Matrix. You're going out on a normal day and suddenly you're thrust into a moment that defies logic. A split-second rip in reality where you catch a glimpse of something you're not meant to see. What was that bus? Why did all those people look like they had been in some kind of catastrophic accident? And why of all things were they staring at me? Sometimes I wonder if we stumbled into a place we weren't supposed to be in, a thin veil between our world and something else. Maybe that fallen signpost was never meant to be found. Maybe we followed the wrong road and briefly slipped into another layer of existence. one where the bus and its passengers were stuck, replaying their tragedy over and over, shocked that I could see them, shocked that there was a witness, and with their pleading eyes, all they could do was stare. I'll never know for sure, but I know one thing, it's something I think about often. Hence all the theories. And every time I think about that day, I get a shiver right down my spine. I would just like to make a brief warning about this next story. There are some quite grotesque descriptions, so if that's not your bag or you get queasy easily, maybe have second thoughts about this one. It's pretty dark, but it's a very interesting story. This is a haunting tale about the weight of human karma and the terrifying consequences of breaking taboos. My father's hometown, nestled in a remote and isolated part of the country, was just the kind of place where ancient traditions clung to life long after they had faded elsewhere. Until the early 1960s, the village practiced a peculiar and macabre custom, a form of cannibalism. It wasn't born out of famine, desperation, or sacrificial rituals. Rather, it was an eerie, spiritual act of reverence for the dead. Think of it as a human equivalent to a sky burial, a practice where the remains of the deceased are offered to nature. In this case, it was referred to as a human burial. The ritual was performed at a small, unassuming shrine in a village. When someone passed away, the shrine priest would consume parts of the deceased, specifically their brain or spinal cord. The act was believed to transfer the soul or essence of the dead into the priest. Acting as a medium, the priest would then channel messages from the deceased to their grieving family. Though grotesque by modern standards, this practice was not seen as barbaric by villagers. It was, in their eyes, a sacred rite, a way to preserve the bond between the living and the dead. By the early 1960s, however, the winds of change had reached even this remote village. Legal reforms, changing societal attitudes, and the general march of progress made it clear that the practice could no longer continue. Around this time, the shrine priest, an aging man who had carried out the ritual for decades, passed the role to his son. The younger priest was less inclined to maintain such traditions, seeing them as relics of a bygone era. But the older generation of villagers, especially the elderly, were deeply attached to the custom. They pleaded with him to continue to perform the ritual for their funerals, insisting it was the only way that they could depart the world in peace. Reluctantly, and perhaps out of familial duty, the young priest agreed. He carried on the practice for several years, consuming the brains of the deceased as part of the ritual. But as time went on, the strain of this macabre duty began to weigh on him. What no one could have anticipated was the horrifying price that he would pay for continuing this tradition. Roughly 20 years after taking over as the shrine priest, the young man, now middle-aged, began to exhibit strange and terrifying symptoms. It started with a fever that refused to subside, leaving him bedridden for days. Then his face began to swell grotesquely, his eyes bulging unnaturally from their sockets. His body was racked with profuse sweating, so intense that he would be in a constant state of dehydration. No matter how much water he drank, his thirst remained unquenchable. His appearance became monstrous, his swollen face dripping with sweat, and wide, desperate eyes gave him an almost inhuman look. To those around him, he seemed cursed, as though some dark force was punishing him for his role in the ancient ritual. Desperate, his family took him to the nearest hospital, but the doctors were baffled. They found no discernible cause for his symptoms, and despite their best efforts, his condition only worsened. 6 months later, he succumbed to his mysterious illness. In his final days, strange fluids oozed from his eyes, nose, and ears, as his descent into madness was both swift and horrifying. An autopsy revealed a shocking discovery. His brain had been decaying while he was still alive. News of the priest's death spread through the village, sparking rumors and speculations. Many villagers believed that he had been cursed for abandoning or mishandling the sacred tradition. Others wondered if the practice itself had always carried a hidden danger, one that had finally claimed its first victim. Decades passed, and by the early 2000s, the story of the cursed priest had become little more than a dark village legend. By then, history repeated itself. The priest's son, now an adult with a family of his own, began exhibiting symptoms eerily similar to those that afflicted his father. A high fever struck him down, followed by the same grotesque swelling, profuse sweating, and insatiable thirst. Panicked, his family rushed him to the hospital. This time the doctors were better equipped to investigate his condition. They concluded a battery of tests, but the results were inconclusive. His resembled certain neurological disorders such as Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, CJD, or Kuru, both of which were rare forms of prion disease. Prion diseases are caused by misfolded proteins in the brain, which lead to sponge-like holes in tissue. These diseases are devastating and incurable. They are known to be linked to the consumption of infected brain or spinal tissue, precisely the kind of act performed in the village's ancient rituals. The theory was clear. The priest's family had inherited the consequences of their forebears' actions. The consumption of human brains, even decades earlier, had introduced prions into their bloodline. Prion diseases have extraordinarily long incubation periods, sometimes spanning decades, making it possible for symptoms to appear generations later. Despite the doctor's efforts, the son's condition deteriorated rapidly. Like his father, he died in agony, his body succumbing to dehydration and systematic failure. An autopsy confirmed prion-related damage to his brain, which was preserved for further study. This isn't just a grim tale of ancient rituals, it's a deeply personal family history. The priest who first fell victim to this curse was my uncle. His son, who died decades later, was my cousin. My father, thankfully, has shown no signs of the disease, but I can't shake the fear that it might resurface in our bloodline. Living with this knowledge is like carrying a ticking time bomb. Some doctors insist that the symptoms could only be explained by prion disease, while others suggest the possibility of a genuine supernatural curse. Either way, the legacy of this ancient practice is something I can never escape. It's a chilling reminder of the consequences of breaking taboos, and a story that will haunt my family for generations to come. So this is something that happened to me and my coworker, who I'll just call N, a few years ago at Shin Nihonbashi Station on the JR Keio line. Honestly, I've never been able to shake it off, and every time I think about it, I just get this weird cold feeling. It's one of those stories that sound like total BS, But I swear it's real. And if you've got a moment, let me tell you about the stain in the underground. Yeah, I mean a literal stain that almost killed someone. Ed and I were waiting on the platform for our train. We wanted to get on the last carriage, so we were standing all the way at the far end, closest facing Tokyo Station. It was just your typical day. Commuters coming and going, people lining up, getting off, nothing unusual. At first I wasn't paying much attention to the wall near us, but then I noticed something. There was this weird human-shaped stain on it. You know how stains usually look like random blotches? This one wasn't like that. It was too distinct. It looked exactly like a person, a woman, to be specific, with her arms outstretched, as if she was waving, or worse, beckoning. I nudged N and said, "Hey, doesn't that look like a woman trying to wave us over? It's pretty weird." And when I turned to see if N agreed, I realized something was seriously wrong. He wasn't laughing it off or even rolling his eyes at me. Instead, he was crouched down, his body shaking like a leaf. "What's wrong?" I asked. But he didn't answer right away. He was pale, like ghostly pale. His lips were trembling, and when he finally managed to speak, his voice was barely audible. "Help me, please," he whispered, his words shaking as much as his body. Now here's the thing about N. He's got this freaky sixth sense. He's one of those people who can just feel things. Spirits, bad vibes, you name it. I used to think it was cool, but at that moment, I hated it. Because if N was freaking out, then it meant that something really bad was happening. "What's going on? What do you mean, help you?" I asked, trying to keep calm. "I'm being pulled," he said, his voice cracking. "Something's pulling me towards the tracks. Please help me." And that's when I noticed his feet. They were sliding, actually sliding towards the edge of the platform. It wasn't like he was moving them on his own. It was like there was this invisible force that was dragging him. His upper body was arched back like he was fighting against it, but his feet were still inching forward, little by little. The sound they made, this faint scraping noise, was enough to make my stomach churn. I panicked. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed him by the arms and yanked him away from the edge, pulling him back towards the middle of the platform. He'd only moved about 15 or 20 centimeters, but let me tell you, it felt like miles. If I hadn't reacted, I'm pretty sure he would have been dragged right onto the tracks. Once we were safe in the middle of the platform, I asked him what the hell had just happened. N was shaking so hard I thought that he might collapse. "Did you see that stain?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Yeah, that creepy one that looks like a person. What about it?" "It's not just a stain," he said. "It's a woman. She's there." "What are you talking about?" "I looked at it," he said, his eyes darting around like he was afraid that she might still be watching. "I made eye contact with her, and then the wall. It changed. It turned into hands. So many hands. They were all reaching at once, grabbing me. They were pulling me. I couldn't stop them. I couldn't." He broke off, visibly shaking, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "It's not just a ghost or some bad energy," he said. "It's pure evil. Whatever it is, it's dangerous. People shouldn't go near it. Stay away." After that, I avoided Shin Nihonbashi Station for a long time. I am the superstitious type, can you blame me? But life goes on, and eventually I had to go back, years later. I heard that they renovated the station not long before I went back. They painted over the walls, including the one with the stain that freaked my friend out so badly. So I thought it was gone, but then I saw it again. Yeah, you heard me. The stain came back, the same spot, the same shape, same creepy outstretched arm. It didn't matter that the wall had been painted. It just reappeared like it had been waiting all along. The new stain was just as vivid as the old one. The outline was sharp, almost too sharp. There was something about it. Something darker. It didn't just look like a woman anymore. It felt like one, standing there looking at it. I swear I could feel her watching me, like she was daring to come closer. So if you ever find yourself in Shin Nihonbashi Station, do yourself a favor, stay away from the far end of the platform near Tokyo Station. And if you see a human-shaped stain on the wall, don't look at it too closely. Don't try to figure out what it is. Whatever that thing is, it doesn't want to be ignored. It wants you to notice it. And once you do, it might not let go. I don't know if this stain is tied to some ancient curse, a tragic death, or something else entirely. All I know is that it's real and it's dangerous, so please be careful. And if you're one of those people who doesn't believe in this kind of stuff, trust me, this isn't something you want to test. A few years ago, a friend and I rented a secluded lakehouse for a weekend getaway. It was a charming little place, the kind of spot where you'd expect nothing but peace and quiet. After 4 hours on the road, we finally arrived, eager to unpack and relax. But the moment we stepped inside, something felt off. As I set down my bag, I noticed a figure slumped by the fireplace, partially obscured by shadows. For a moment my heart stopped. I thought it was a person. I hurried over only to realize that it was a mannequin, face down, on the floor. Its limbs were splayed awkwardly, and its blank, featureless head seemed strangely sinister in the dim light. "Must have been a prank by the last guests," my friend said, laughing it off. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that it gave me. Wanting it out of my sight, I carried the mannequin to the corner of the room and propped it there, its lifeless frame leaning against the wall. My friend left shortly after to grab some groceries from a nearby town, leaving me alone. Exhausted from the drive, I decided to lie down for a quick nap. As I drifted off, I couldn't shake the image of that mannequin, slumped in the corner. I had to keep reassuring myself that I set it facing the wall. I knew I had. When sleep came, so did the dream. I was in the lake, struggling to keep my head above the water. The water was cold, so cold and relentless. I was being dragged down, under, and no matter how hard I fought, I couldn't reach the surface. I couldn't breathe. My lungs burned as icy water filled them. In the dream I could see the shore in the distance, but it felt impossibly far. Just as I thought I was about to drown, I woke up gasping, lurching forward, drenched in sweat. That's when I saw that the mannequin was no longer in the corner. It was now facing my direction, just off from the foot of the bed, its face turned directly towards me. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat there frozen, unsure if I was still dreaming. The room was pitch dark apart from the faint outline of its rigid frame. Slowly I reached for the bedside lamp, fumbling to turn it on. When the light flickered to life, I was sure that the mannequin was somehow closer than it had been in the dark. Naturally, I was horrified. It hadn't been there before. I left that thing slumped in the corner, and I was alone. My friend hadn't returned yet. I didn't stick around to find out what happened or how it moved. I just grabbed my shoes, bolted out of the front door, and waited outside on the stoop, trembling in the cool night air. I wanted my jacket, but I was just too scared to go inside. The lake was eerily calm, but every creak of the house behind me and every rustle of the surrounding trees made my stomach twist. At one point I thought I heard faint tapping from the inside, as if to rile me, to rouse my attention. I couldn't bring myself to go back and check on what it was though. Minutes felt like hours until I finally saw my friend's headlights cutting through the darkness. When he stepped out of the car, I was already halfway to him, stammering about what had just happened. He laughed nervously, assuming it was some kind of prank or my overactive imagination, but I insisted that we leave. We packed up and found a different place to stay that night. It's been years since that weekend, and I've never gone back to that lake house. Sometimes I wonder what I would have seen if I stayed a little longer, or worse, gone back to sleep. I can't explain what happened that night, but the possibilities still haunt me. Was it possible that someone had broken in while I was napping and moved the mannequin just to mess with me? If so, why? Why didn't they take anything? Or worse, confront me? Maybe they were just trying to prank someone. Or could it have been something far darker, tied to the house itself? The drowning dream, the mannequin, the eerie stillness outside, all of it felt connected, as though the house was alive in its own terrible way. I'll never know for sure, but one thing for certain is, whatever was in that house, it wanted to remind me that I wasn't alone.